The first letter arrived like a threat disguised as courtesy, the kind of envelope that carried more poison than paper. It bore the HOA's insignia at the top, bold and smug, as if the weight of a printed logo could intimidate me. Inside, typed in stiff legalese, was the accusation: violation of HOA Code 4.3.2, unauthorized use of open flame cooking appliances. Fine assessed $70,000. $70,000 for barbecuing on my own land. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh, but the bile rising in my throat cut that laugh short. It wasn't just about a grill. It was about power, about control, about the smug empire the HOA president Karen, of course, had been building like a fortress, brick by brick, rule by rule. She was large in body and larger in ego, a woman who strutted around the lakeside as if the rippling water itself answered to her. I'd caught her once measuring my lawn with a tape measure, muttering about grass-length ordinances, and another time peering over my fence with a clipboard like a prison guard inspecting inmates. But this time she had gone too far. My land wasn't part of their manicured subdivision, and I had made that clear when I bought the property. It was old family land, stretching down to the very lake the HOA loved to flaunt in their brochures as community-owned. Except it wasn't community-owned. It was mine. The deeds were tucked safely in a fireproof box, documents dating back 3 generations, signed, sealed, and notarized. The HOA's power ended where my fence began. Or at least it should have. When I brought the letter to my wife, her laughter turned bitter. 70,000? They think they can bankrupt us for cooking ribs? She shook her head, her braids swaying as she tossed the papers onto the table. Marcus, this isn't just harassment anymore. This is war. The next week Karen escalated. She showed up with 2 HOA board members, waddling across my lawn without permission, holding up a laminated binder as though it were a badge. You've been warned, she declared loud enough for neighbors to hear. Barbecuing without HOA approval creates fire hazards, and it lowers property values. The fine stands, and if you don't pay, we'll place a lien on your home. Her voice oozed arrogance, but her eyes gleamed with something darker: expectation. She thought I'd fold, thought I'd beg or cut a check just to make her disappear. Instead, I folded my arms, let the silence stretch until it made her sweat under the summer sun, and then said, "You have no authority here. This isn't HOA land. This is my land." Karen snorted, her round face flushed. "Everything around this lake falls under HOA jurisdiction. You agreed to it when you moved in." That was the moment I pulled out the folder I'd carried like a shield. Deeds, maps, surveys, proof that the very lake she claimed as hers had belonged to my family long before her HOA even existed. I held up the oldest deed, the ink faded but still legible, dated 1928. "No, Karen," I said, my voice cutting like steel. "Everything around this lake falls under my jurisdiction, and that includes the water you claim to own." The gasp that came from one of the board members was almost comical. Karen's face went slack, her mouth opening and closing as she processed what she just heard. She recovered quickly, but the wobble in her voice betrayed her. That's impossible. The HOA controls the lake. We host events there, fishing tournaments, boating. It's always been that way. Tradition doesn't equal ownership," I replied, stepping closer until the sunlight glinted off the documents in my hand. "You've been trespassing on private property for years, and now you're trying to fine me for using my own land. That's not just arrogance, Karen. That's fraud." The twist came sooner than anyone expected. From the crowd of neighbors who had gathered at the edge of my lawn, a new voice rang out, strong and clear. "He's telling the truth." We all turned to see Mr. Lawson, the quiet old man who lived 2 streets over. He was no stranger, but he kept to himself, his weathered face usually hidden under the brim of a fishing hat. Now he stepped forward with a battered leather folder in hand. "I worked for the county records office for 30 years. I know this land. That lake has never been HOA property. It's always been in the Miller family trust." He pointed at me. "His family's trust." Karen's composure shattered. She stammered, her pudgy hands flapping uselessly in the humid air. That can't be true. We maintain the lake. We pay for landscaping. Mr. Lawson's chuckle was rough like gravel. And you've been wasting money on land you don't own. Maybe you should explain that to your HOA members when they learn where their fees have been going. The crowd murmured, cell phones lifted, recording everything. Karen's empire was cracking right in front of her, and she knew it. She tried to rally, puffing up her chest, but her voice lacked its usual venom. This isn't over, she hissed. We'll fight this in court. Good, I said, because I've already filed an injunction. And when the judge sees these deeds, it won't be me writing checks, it'll be you. The tension snapped like a taut rope. Karen stormed off, her board members trailing behind like frightened shadows. But the fight was far from over. What none of us knew yet was how deep her fraud ran, and how many people she had been bleeding dry under the guise of community fees. That night, as I sat by the lake with Alana, the water reflecting the fiery streaks of sunset, I felt a storm brewing, not in the sky, but in the walls of the HOA itself. Karen thought she could bury us under $70,000 worth of threats. Instead, she had unearthed her own downfall. And I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was only the beginning. The days after that confrontation unfolded like dominoes falling one by one, each click louder than the last. Karen tried to bluster her way through, sending follow-up letters dripping with threats of liens, foreclosures, and legal costs. But what she didn't realize was that by pushing for war, she had opened the gates to her own ruin. I wasn't bluffing when I mentioned the injunction. My attorney filed it the very next morning, attaching the deeds, surveys, and sworn affidavits from both my family's trust and Mr. Lawson, the retired county records clerk who had publicly vouched for us. Within a week, the county court issued a temporary restraining order against the HOA, forbidding them from levying fines or entering my property until ownership was clarified. That paper might as well have been a battering ram. It stopped Karen's campaign cold. But the bigger hammer fell when the case escalated to discovery. For the first time, the HOA's financials were dragged into daylight. The audit revealed a horror show. Thousands of dollars in lake maintenance fees, charged annually to homeowners, had been funneled into private accounts under Karen's control. Landscaping companies that didn't exist. Security patrols that were nothing more than her nephew driving an ATV around once a month. Even event insurance for fishing tournaments that had never been filed. The numbers didn't just suggest fraud, they screamed it. When the news hit the community, neighbors who had once cowered before her clipboard rose in fury. At an emergency HOA meeting, voices shook the rafters of the clubhouse. One woman, trembling with anger, waved her invoice in the air. You charged me $1,200 last year to preserve the shoreline. Now I find out the shoreline isn't even yours. A man near the back shouted, We trusted you, Karen. You robbed us blind. Karen, perched at the head of the table in her oversized chair, tried to regain control. Her face was red, sweat glistening at her temples. These accusations are baseless. I've served this community for years. Everything I did was for property values and safety. But then came the twist none of us saw coming. One of her own board members, a timid man named Reed, stood up. His hands shook as he clutched a folder. I can't do this anymore, he muttered, voice cracking. She made us sign fake contracts. She told us if we didn't, we'd be liable personally. I have copies. I have everything. He dropped the folder on the table with a thud. Documents spilled out, mails, forged bids, altered bank statements. The room gasped as cameras clicked, neighbors recording it all. Karen lunged to snatch the papers, but Reed stepped back, shaking his head. I'm done covering for you, Karen. That was the night her fortress collapsed. The court hearings that followed were packed, standing room only. Reporters filed in, pens ready to capture every morsel of suburban drama. On one side, Karen sat with her lawyer, her bulk spilling over the bench, her scowl daring anyone to challenge her. On the other, I sat with Alana, holding the very deed that proved the lake was ours, feeling the weight of history and justice in my hands. The judge wasted no time. After reviewing the records, he declared in open court that the lake and surrounding land had been under the Miller Family Trust for nearly a century. The HOA had no legal claim. Furthermore, he added sternly, the board's collection of fees for use of private property constitutes fraud and misrepresentation. Karen erupted, slamming her palms on the table. You can't do this. That lake belongs to the community. We've used it for years. We've improved it. The judge's gavel cracked. Silence, or you will be held in contempt. His voice turned cold. Usage does not equal ownership, Mrs. Trask. You've trespassed, extorted, and defrauded your neighbors, and you will answer for it. When the verdict came, it was devastating for her. Restitution was ordered. Every dollar collected for lake fees over the past 10 years had to be returned. Civil penalties stacked on top, along with criminal charges for fraud. Karen's house, the grand two-story she loved to parade as a symbol of her authority, was seized to begin repayment. The day they padlocked her door, neighbors gathered on their lawns, watching silently as movers carried out her possessions. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered prayers of thanks. And a few, I admit, smiled in quiet satisfaction. But the story didn't just end with Karen's downfall. Something bigger grew out of her ashes. At the first community gathering after the trial, held not in the stuffy HOA clubhouse but on the banks of the lake itself, people came together in a way they hadn't in years. There was food, music, laughter. Kids splashed in the shallows without fear of being scolded. Someone had painted a handmade sign and nailed it to a post. Welcome to Miller Lake, open to all by invitation of the owner. I had written beneath it in bold letters, community belongs to people, not to bullies. Neighbors approached me one by one, some with tears in their eyes. Mr. Patel clasped my hand and said, you didn't just protect your rights, you freed us from her grip. Mrs. Delgado hugged Alana and whispered, you gave us back our dignity. And perhaps the most touching moment came from Reed, the timid board member who had exposed Karen. He approached cautiously, guilt heavy in his eyes. I should have spoken up sooner, he admitted. I let her scare me into silence. I put a hand on his shoulder. What matters is you spoke up when it counted. That took courage. From that day on, the lake became more than just water and land. It became a symbol, a place where the community gathered freely, not under the watchful eyes of an HOA tyrant, but under the open sky, united in respect and fairness. We held barbecues every summer weekend. The smell of ribs and corn on the cob wafting across the water like defiance turned into celebration. And as for Karen, word spread that she moved to another state, forced to start over with nothing. Some pitied her, others didn't. For me, her story was a reminder that arrogance built on lies eventually topples under the weight of truth. On warm evenings, when the sun sinks low and the lake glitters like liquid gold, Alana often leans into me and says, do you remember when she tried to fine us 70 grand for barbecue? And I laugh, shaking my head. I do. And I remember when she learned the whole lake was ours. Because that's the heart of it. Karen thought power was in paperwork, threats, and fear. But real power was in truth, in community, in people willing to stand together when one of them was attacked. She fell not because of me alone, but because we all decided enough was enough. So I ask you now, was Karen's punishment enough? Or should people like her face even harsher consequences for abusing their neighbors and the law? Share your thoughts, because the fight against injustice is never over, and every voice matters.